Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for our chapter book story time here at the Caribou Public Library. I'm Miss Erin, and today we're going to be reading another section of chapter 10, which is called Full Moon. This is going to be the middle section because this chapter is as lengthy as it is. We wanted to separate it into a couple of shorter parts. All right, so if you remember last time we read, Jane and Michael had just entered a great hall that was filled with throngs of animals at the zoo, right? Excuse me. And none of these animals are in cages. They are out and they're talking with the lion. So he is showing them around. "Ah, splendid, isn't it?" said the lion proudly. "Just like the dear old jungle days. But come along, we must get good places." And he pushed his way through the crowd, saying, "Gangway, gangway," and dragging Jane and Michael after him. Presently, through a little clearing in the middle of the hall, they were able to get a glimpse of the cages. "Why," said Michael, pointing his mouth very wide. Opening his mouth very wide. "They're full of human beings." And they were. In one cage, two large middle-aged gentlemen in top hats and striped trousers were prowling up and down, anxiously gazing through the bars as though they were waiting for something. Children of all shapes and sizes, from babies in long clothes upwards, were scrambling about in another cage. The animals outside regarded these with great interest, and some of them tried to make the babies laugh by thrusting their paws or their tails in through the bars. A little giraffe stretched out its long neck out over the heads of other animals and let a little boy in a sailor suit tickle its nose. In the third cage, three elderly ladies in raincoats and galoshes were imprisoned. One of them was knitting, but the other two were standing near the bars, shouting at the animals and poking at them with their umbrellas. "Nasty brutes! Go away! I want my tea!" screamed one of them. "Isn't she funny?" said several of the animals, and they laughed loudly at her. "Jane, look!" said Michael, pointing to the cage at the end of the row. "Isn't that Admiral Boom?" said Jane, looking very surprised. And Admiral Boom it was. He was ramping up and down in his cage, coughing and blowing his nose and sputtering with rage. Here is the picture of poor Admiral Boom. And the sign in front has his name on it. "Blast my gizzard! All hands to the pump! Land ho! Heave away there! Blast my gizzard!" shouted the Admiral. Every time he came near the bars, a tiger prodded him gently with a stick, and this made Admiral Boom swear dreadfully. "But how did they all get in there?" Jane asked the lion. "Lost," said the lion, "or rather left behind. These are the people who've dawdled and left behind inside when the gates were shut. Got to put 'em somewhere, so we keep 'em here. He's dangerous, that one there. Nearly did for his keeper not long ago. Don't go near him." And he pointed at Admiral Boom. "Stand back, please. Stand back. Don't crush. Make way, please." Jane and Michael could hear several voices crying these words loudly. "Ah, now they're going to be fed," said the lion, excitedly pressing forward in the crowd. "Here come the keepers." 4 brown bears, each wearing a peaked cap, were trundling trolleys of food along a little corridor that separated the animals from the cages. "Stand back there," they said, whenever an animal got in the way. Then they opened a small door in each cage and thrust the food through on pronged forks. Jane and Michael had a good view of what was happening through a gap between a panther and a dingo. Bottles of milk were being thrown in to the babies, who made soft little grabs with their hands and clutched them greedily. The older children snatched sponge cakes and donuts from the forks and began to eat ravenously. Plates of thin bread and butter and wholemeal scones were provided for the ladies in galoshes, and the gentlemen in top hats had lamb cutlets and custard in glasses. Pretty amazing meal, it sounds like to me. These, as they received their food, took it away into a corner, spread handkerchiefs over their striped trousers, and began to eat. Presently, as the keepers passed down the line of cages, a great commotion was heard. "Blast my victuals! Call that a meal? A skimpy little round of beef and a couple of cabbages. What, no Yorkshire pudding? Outrageous! Up with the anchor! Where's my port? Port, I say! Heave her over! Below there. Where's the Admiral's port?" "Listen to him. He's turned nasty. I tell you, he's not safe, that one," said the lion. Jane and Michael did not need to be told whom he meant. They knew Admiral Boom's language too well. "Well," said the lion, as the noise in the hall grew less uproarious, "that appears to be the end, and I'm afraid, if you'll excuse me, I must be getting along. See you later at the Grand Chain, I hope. I'll look out for you." And leading them to the door, he took his leave of them, sidling away, swinging his curled mane, his golden body dappled with moonlight and shadow. "Oh, please," Jane called after him, but he was out of hearing. "I wanted to ask him if they'd ever get out. The poor humans, why, it might have been John and Barbara or any of us." She turned to Michael, but found that he was no longer by her side. He had moved away along one of the paths, and running after him, she found him talking to a penguin who was standing in the middle of the path with a large copybook under one wing and an enormous pencil under the other. He was biting the end of it thoughtfully as she approached. "I can't think," she heard Michael saying, apparently in an answer to a question. The penguin turned to Jane. "Perhaps you can tell me," he said. "Now, what rhymes with Mary? I can't use contrary because that has been done before, and one must be original. If you're going to say fairy, don't. I've thought of that already, but it's not like her. It's not a bit like her. It won't do." "Harry," said Michael brightly. Not poetic enough," observed the penguin. "What about wary?" said Jane. "Well," the penguin appeared to be considering it. "It's not very good, is it?" he said forlornly. "I'm afraid I'll have to give it up. You see, I was trying to write a poem for the birthday. I thought it would be so nice if I began, 'Oh, Mary, Mary,' and then I just couldn't get any further. It's very annoying. They expect something learned from a penguin, and I don't want to disappoint them. Well, well, you mustn't keep me. I must get on with it." And with that, he hurried away, biting his pencil and bending over his copybook. "This is all very confusing," said Jane. "Whose birthday is it, I wonder?" Do you know whose birthday it might be? Maybe. We'll have to see. "Now come along, you two, come along. You want to pay your respects, I suppose, it being the birthday and all," said a voice behind them, and turning they saw the brown bear who had given them their tickets at the gate. "Oh, of course," said Jane, thinking that was the safest thing to say, but not knowing in the least whom they were paying their respects to. The brown bear put an arm around each of them and propelled them along the path. They could feel his warm, soft fur brushing against their bodies and hear the rumbles his voice made in his stomach when he talked. Here we are, said the brown bear, stopping before a small house whose windows were all so brightly lit that if it hadn't been a moonlit night, you would have thought the sun was shining. The bear opened the door and gently pushed the two children through it. The light dazzled them at first, but their eyes soon became accustomed to it, and they saw that they were in the snake house. All the cages were open, and the snakes were out. Some curled lazily into great scaly knots, and others slipping gently about on the floor. And in the middle of the snakes, on a log that had evidently been brought from one of the cages, sat Mary Poppins. Jane and Michael could hardly believe their eyes. "Couple of birthday guests, ma'am," announced the brown bear respectfully. The snakes turned their heads inquiringly toward the children. Mary Poppins did not move, but she spoke. "And where is your overcoat, may I ask?" she demanded, looking crossly, but without surprise, at Michael. "And your hat and gloves," she snapped, turning to Jane. But before either of them had time to reply, there was a stir in the snake house. Hissst, hissst. The snakes, with this soft hissing sound, were rising up on end and bowing to something behind Jane and Michael. The brown bear took off his peaked cap, and slowly Mary Poppins, too, stood up. My dear child," said a small, delicate, hissing voice. And out from the largest of the cages there came, with slow, soft, winding movements, a Hamadryad. He slid his graceful curves past the bowing snakes and the brown bear toward Mary Poppins. And when he reached her, he raised the front half of his long golden body and, thrusting upwards his scaly golden hood, daintily kissed her, first on one cheek and then the other. "So," he hissed softly, "this is very pleasant. Very pleasant indeed. It is long since your birthday fell on a full moon, my dear. He turned his head. Be seated, friends, he said, bowing graciously to the other snakes, who, at that word, slid reverently to the floor again, coiled themselves up, and gazed steadily at the Hamadryad and Mary Poppins. The Hamadryad turned then to Jane and Michael, and with a little shiver they saw that his face was smaller and more wizened than anything they had ever seen. They took a step forward, for this curious deep eyes seemed to draw them toward him. Long and narrow they were, with a dark, sleepy look in them, and in the middle of that dark sleepiness a wakeful light glittered like a jewel. And who, may I ask, are these? He said in his soft, terrifying voice, looking at the children inquiringly. Miss Jane Banks and Master Michael Banks at your service, said the brown bear gruffly, as though he were half afraid. Her friends. Ah, her friends. Then they are welcome, my dears. Pray be seated. Jane and Michael, feeling somehow that they were in the presence of a king, as they had not felt when they met the lion, with difficulty drew their eyes from that compelling gaze and looked round for something to sit on. The brown bear provided this by squatting down himself and offering them each a furry knee. Jane said in a whisper, He talks as though he were a great lord. He is. He's the lord of our world, the wisest and most terrible of us all, said the brown bear softly and reverently. The Hamadryad smiled, a long, slow, secret smile, and turned to Mary Poppins. Cousin, he began, gently hissing. Is she really his cousin? Whispered Michael. First cousin once removed on the mother's side, returned the brown bear, whispering the information behind his paw. But listen now, he's going to give the birthday present. Cousin, repeated the Hamadryad, it is long since your birthday fell on the full moon, and long since we have been able to celebrate the event as we celebrate it tonight. I have, therefore, had time to give the question of your birthday present some consideration. And I have decided, he paused, and there was no sound in the snake house, but the sound of many creatures all holding their breath, that I cannot do better than to give you one of my own skins. Indeed, cousin, it is too kind of you, began Mary Poppins, but the Hamadryad held up his hood for silence. Not at all, not at all. You know that I change my skin from time to time, and that one more or less means little to me. Am I not? He paused and looked around him. The Lord of the Jungle, hissed all the snakes in unison, as though the question and the answer were part of a well-known ceremony. The Hamadryad nodded. So, he said, what seems good to me will seem so to you. It is a small enough gift, dear Mary, but it may serve for a belt or a pair of shoes, even a hatband. These things always come in useful, you know. And with that, he began to sway gently from side to side, and it seemed to Jane and Michael as they watched that little waves were running up his body from the tail to the head. Suddenly, he gave a long, twisting corkscrew leap, and his golden outer skin lay on the floor, and in its place he was wearing a new coat of shining silver. Wait, said the Hamadryad, as Mary Poppins bent to pick up the skin. I will write a greeting upon it. And he ran his tail very quickly along his thrown skin, deftly bent the golden sheath into a circle, and diving his head through this, as though it were a crown, offered it graciously to Mary Poppins. She took it, bowing. I just can't thank you enough, she began, and paused. She was evidently very pleased, for she kept running the skin backwards and forwards through her fingers and looking at it admiringly. And that is where we're going to stop for today. So next time we will continue with the end of chapter 10. We'll see you then. Bye for now.